Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about the origins of the labor movement. In our previous unit, we were talking about how race and power was basically two elements that guided the development of the political and social and even economic organization of British Honduras. So today we're going to be talking about the labor movement. And when we talk about labor movement, we're talking about the people that are working or are as a workforce or either unemployed as well. And movement also refers to the organization and starting of organizations to fight for either rights, raise a pay, or some sort of other leverage that their employers or the government could give them. So today's class is basically organized in two things. One, we're going to explain the Great Depression's impact on the economy of British Honduras, and secondly, we're going to describe the early origins of labor movements in British Honduras. So basically, this will be a cause and effect, because one of the things that we need to understand is that world economy at this point, or even regional economic systems, impact British Honduras, and eventually that impact is felt by the people that are working or are not working, and then that is what eventually caused the inception of labor movements in British Honduras. So the first thing is, first we need to understand what is the Great Depression or how it occurred. So in 1921 there was a crash of the stock market, and this crash eventually led to some banks closing. It eventually led to massive unemployment. Industries were falling in the USA and Europe, and because of this the industrialized world was basically going down. And with the going down of the industrialized world, you see also a number of people being unemployed. They're being laid off. Eventually you also see that this economic crash in the USA begins to impact other parts of the world. In fact, just as COVID-19, as you can see, is impacting the world globally, the Great Depression was impacting the world globally as well, because you see that economically everybody begins to feel that the Great Depression is happening in the USA. So the buying power of people begin to go down. People begin to get laid off, and it was not only happening in the USA, but it was also happening within British Honduras. Within British Honduras, as you can see, the unemployment rate increased dramatically. So people now begin to get laid off, and it is because people begin to get laid off that you see a lot of people beginning to think about organizing themselves to get some sort of rights. But in addition to people getting laid off, you see that export prices were going down, imports were dropping drastically. So the government is having issues with generating some sort of revenue. And in addition to that, the government finances collapse dramatically. So you see businesses going down, private businesses going down. You see government businesses or government intake or revenue goes down, employment going up, and exports going down. So basically, economically, British Honduras is going down as well. And this, of course, has to be felt by the people at the lower end of society, or at the lower end or at the lower ladder of the economic system. So you could imagine in British Honduras, large numbers of people were being laid off. And this amount of people being laid off, we could say, relates to what is happening today in Belize. Look at how COVID-19 has impacted our economy, and look at how COVID-19 has caused the laying off of so many of people that either we know or even our parents, if you want to talk about that. So to move on, you see that the situation isn't looking good for British Honduras, right? The Great Depression is impacting the settlement. And in addition to that, by 1931, you also have a hurricane impacting the settlement. So 1929, you have the crash of the world market. We could say the Great Depression started. By 1931, you have the hurricane occurring, and the hurricane eventually worsened the conditions. It worsened the conditions because, one, the people were economically weak already. Our British Honduras, in this case, was already weak economically and socially. So the hurricane further created damage and havoc in the settlement, and this eventually created a situation where people were close to starvation. As you can see, even the programs that the government created to offer some sort of relief to unemployment failed dramatically. And in addition to that, people were close to starvation, and they were being fed with rice lab, a porridge of boiled rice with sugar, and it was distributed to the public. So take a look at that, right? That was what was distributed to the public. So you could imagine that the situation was very critical at this point in British Honduras. So in all of this, you have the Great Depression occurring. You have the hurricane occurring as well. So you could imagine that the situation in British Honduras was that of insecurity and instability as well. So within all of that, within the Great Depression and the hurricane affecting British Honduras, is where you have the birth of a group of people that are unemployed. So you have a rising number of people that are unemployed, and because you have a rising number of people that are unemployed, you see that they begin to organize themselves. So innately, they are not even fighting for a raise of pay, but they are fighting to get higher. They're fighting to be a labor force. You understand? And at this point, you see that they begin to march through the city, and they also begin to pressure the government to have some sort of relief program that will be effective to them. The governor decides that he's going to register all of them, and 1,800 of them are registered. But the government's efforts to find a job for them were fruitless. Only 80 persons were hired. You could imagine that out of 1,800 people, 80 persons were hired. And the jobs that they got were meager jobs, you could say, or jobs that were labor intensive and were cheaply paid. So eventually at this point is when you have leaders of the UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Association, resigning from their jobs. But you have people more and more developing consciousness. And it is the development of this consciousness that basically creates a leader. It not only creates or brings to the forefront a leader, but also creates an organization that is going to be fighting for the labor force and is going to be fighting for the unemployed. And this is where you have the origins of a great man, a man who was a barber, Antonio Soberanes. Antonio Soberanes is known for his famous quote, "I'd rather be a dead hero than a living coward." Antonio Soberanes eventually saw the need to organize people to fight for their rights and fight for employment. So he began to organize a lot of meetings around Battlefield Park, and he was such a good leader and such a good orator. He could talk really well, that he began to unify people. He began to attack the Belize Estate Company. He began to attack the rich merchants. He began to attack the colonial system and the colonial officials. And he eventually became the voice for all of those desperate people that were looking for a job or had a job and wanted more rights. So he managed to unify them. And that is where you have the early arms of unions in Belize coming about through the Labor and Unemployed Association. So, as I had stated, Soberanes did a lot of work. He organized a number of pickets, he organized a number of boycotts, but one of his most important achievements includes that of achieving the raise of wages for dock workers from 8 cents to 25 cents. It may seem like a little at this point, but at that point it was a lot of money, right? So to move on, as I had stated, Soberanes was based in Belize City, and Soberanes eventually began to convince more and more people to come out, strike, get some sort of leverage to in relation to the government. So he organized several protests against the BEC, who at this point, the Belize Estate Company, who at this point hired a number of people to work in the extraction of logwood and other forest products. And eventually in 1934, he organized a lot of people to come together and riot for better wages. At that demonstration, it became a bit violent. And even so, Antonio Soberanes, to some extent, was pointed at as being the main perpetrator of this riot. So Antonio Soberanes eventually ended up in jail. And as you can see, even though he was jailed, he gained the respect of many people. And because he gained the respect of many people, he's known today as a Belizean hero, not only for the respect, but for the amount of work that he did to create unionism in Belize. Eventually, Antonio Soberanes ended his political activities by 1942. After that, he eventually left to Panama to work in the Panama Canal. So you see, this man even went to Panama. And by 1950, the Labor and Unemployed Association handed over some of their political power to the People's United Party. And that's another story that we're going to be talking about later on.